When I was in school, we had a variety of courses, some required and some elective, in addition to math, science, and English. Now, the focus is on STEM and testing. So, do we now have better students or just better test takers? Spoiler alert, we didn't build better students.
And get off my lawn!
Thanks for dropping by. I'm CJ, this is Geezer Gab, and today we're going to talk about what happened to American education. It's a big topic, like really big, and this channel is hardly about in-depth investigative reporting, so it's more of an outline than a thesis. Even so, you might as well grab a drink and a snack and stick around, because if you've ever wondered why schools stopped teaching art, music, and civics, or why kids today can't read as well as we could, or why new math keeps coming back like a bad penny, nickel, this one's for you. And of course, like and subscribe. It helps the algorithm find other folks like us, both young and not quite so young. So when I was in school in the 60s and 70s, we had a broad curriculum. The goal wasn't just to make us good at math or reading. It was to make us well-rounded members of society. People who could think critically, create, participate in democracy, and here's a wild idea, enjoy learning. Today, not so much. So how did we get from there to here? And what did we lose along the way? So let me paint you a picture. In the 60s and 70s, we, of course, had math and English. We also had science classes with experiments and, yes, dissections. You didn't just read about the scientific method, you actually had to participate in it. We had civics and or social studies where you learned how government and society worked. We also had art, music, typing, business, history, PE. Physical education was every day, though I could have done without the locker rooms. I'm just saying. There was home ec for learning how to do life things like cook and sew. There were shop classes for learning how to do other life things like wood and metal work and drafting and auto repair. The goal was to create well-rounded graduates, people who could think and create and participate, not just to do work, but to do well in life. Now, in the 2020s, art and music have been cut or minimized. PE, twice a week if you're lucky. Recess, eliminated in many schools. Shop class, home ec, gone. Civics, barely exists. Science, it's mostly test prep. Memorize the periodic table, pass the test, move on. And math and English, they're taught to the test, because if it's not on the standardized test, it doesn't matter. The goal now is to create people who can take their number 2 pencil and fill in the bubble for the right answer on a Scantron sheet. And maybe get a STEM job. So how did we get here? Okay, let's rewind to the 1980s. In 1983, the Reagan administration released a report called A Nation at Risk. The report claimed that American schools were failing, that we were falling behind other countries, that our students couldn't compete. The solution? More testing, more accountability, less fluff. Back to basics, they said. Reading, writing, math, or as they called them, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which, considering only one of those words actually starts with an R, pretty much foreshadowed what was to come. At the same time, Reagan-era budget cuts slashed funding for arts and music programs. Schools had to make choices, And when you're choosing between math teachers and art teachers, well, math wins the job almost every time. And let's not forget the religious pushback on science education. At the time, it was creationism versus evolution. Teach the controversy, they said. Science education came under attack, not because it was bad or wrong, but because it conflicted with certain religio-political agendas. So, by the end of the 80s, the message was clear. Math and reading are essential. Everything else is expendable. Fast forward to 2001. President George W. Bush signs in the No Child Left Behind Act into law. The idea was simple. Hold schools accountable. Test students in reading and math. If schools don't meet the standards, they lose funding. Sounds reasonable, right? Except, here's what actually happened. Schools started teaching to the test because, of course, they would. If it wasn't on the standardized test, it didn't get taught. The other subjects, all cut or minimized. Teachers essentially stopped teaching. They started test prepping. And here's the kicker. The schools that needed the most help, the ones that were already struggling, lost funding because they couldn't magically meet the standards. So they got less money, not more. No Child Left Behind didn't improve education, it narrowed it. And the subjects that got cut, they were ones that actually helped kids gain the skills to think creatively, solve problems, and understand the world around them. And then came the STEM obsession. STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, became the only serious priority. STEM jobs are the future, they said. Everyone should learn to code, they said. Tech companies pushed STEM education hard. They wanted a pipeline of workers, and politicians bought in. STEM, STEM, STEM. Oh, and recently they started calling it STEAM, adding arts to the acronym. But it's mostly window dressing because the funding hasn't increased. And here's the thing. We forgot about everything else. The arts, useless. Humanities, useless. Social studies, useless. Civics, oh, useless. If it wasn't STEM, it didn't matter. And the result? Students today are skilled at standardized tests, but they're worse at critical thinking. They're worse at creativity. They're worse at collaboration. They're worse at understanding how government works. In mental health, crisis levels, anxiety, depression, burnout, all at all-time highs among students. We're not building better students, we're tearing them down. Now, let's talk about testing, because if you're going to understand what went wrong, you need to understand how testing changed. When I was in school, we took standardized tests, but they were diagnostic. They were there to see where you stood compared to other students, what percentile you were in. Maybe a disguised IQ test in first grade or so. The tests didn't determine whether you passed or failed. They didn't determine whether your teacher got fired. They didn't determine whether your school got funding. They were just data points, information. Here's where you are. Here's where you might need help. And then, by high school, you had the PSATs and SATs if you were planning to go to college. You had advanced placement exams if you wanted to try to earn college credit while still in high school. You had things like Math Olympics for fun. At least I thought they were fun. or the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, if you were interested in the military. But here's the key. These tests were optional. They were for you. They helped you figure out your path. They didn't dictate whether you graduated. They didn't dictate whether your school stayed open. And most importantly, teachers didn't teach to the test. Well, AP a little. They taught their curriculum. They taught their subject. And if you learned the material, you'd do fine on whatever test they gave you. Now, testing is everything. Starting in elementary school, kids take high-stakes standardized tests every year. In some states, multiple times a year. These tests determine whether a student passes to the next grade, whether a teacher keeps their job, whether a school gets funding or gets shut down. The tests aren't diagnostic anymore, they're punitive. Kids as young as third grade are having panic attacks over standardized tests because they've been told that if they don't pass, they'll fail. They'll be held back. They'll disappoint their parents, their teachers, their school. And because the stakes are so high, teachers teach to the test. They have to. If their students don't pass, they could lose their job. If the school doesn't meet the standards, it loses funding. So what gets taught? Whatever's on the test. Math and reading, that's it. All those soul-building subjects I mentioned earlier, they're treated like a luxury the budget can't afford. And here's the kicker. The tests don't even measure what they claim to measure. They don't measure critical thinking. They don't measure creativity. They don't measure problem solving. They measure test-taking skills. Did you make the Scantron happy? Congratulations, you're proficient. Teachers don't have the freedom to teach anymore. They have a script, a set curriculum, a pacing guide. And if they deviate from it, if they spend time on something that's not on the test, they're reprimanded. The best teachers, the ones who are creative, passionate, and inspiring, they're leaving the profession in droves for easier, higher-paying jobs. Because they didn't become teachers to administer tests. They became teachers to teach young people. As a result, we've won a teacher shortage, burnout, and a low morale. And what does this do to schools? It creates a two-tiered system. Wealthy schools in affluent neighborhoods can afford to offer art, music, PE, and extracurriculars because their students pass the tests. They meet the standards, they get the funding. Poor schools in low-income neighborhoods, which, to be honest, are more likely to be majority people of color, can't. Because their students, without the added benefit of brain-affirming electives, as well as school meals, struggle on the tests. They don't meet the standards, they lose more funding. So the schools that need the most help get the least help, and the gap between rich and poor widens. And it's not just that the classes in the school day have changed. It's that the school day never ends anymore. In the 60s, homework was a worksheet or a few chapters of reading or the occasional essay. You did it on the bus going home or going to school, or maybe at the kitchen table, and then you went outside to play or listen to records or watch TV. Today, The homework gap is a mountain. We've traded shop class and choir for 3 or more hours of nightly drills and digital portals. We're asking kids to do the overtime of a corporate lawyer just to keep up with a curriculum that's been stripped of its joy for little of any dubious reward. They're burnt out by dinner time, and we wonder why they're anxious? Frankly, I don't envy them at all with this. Okay, to change gears a bit, there's also something that doesn't get talked about enough. After World War II, Europe and Asia were rebuilding. And when you're rebuilding, you have an opportunity to rethink everything, including education. Countries like Finland, Japan, South Korea, and Germany used that opportunity to modernize their education systems to varying degrees. Smaller class sizes, better teacher training, better pay for teachers, emphasis on both STEM and the arts, less non-practical memorization, more critical thinking, universal access, not just for the wealthy. Meanwhile, in the United States, we rested on our laurels. We won the war, we have rockets, we're the best, why change? American schools in the 50s and 60s were good, but we didn't evolve, we didn't improve. We stayed the same. And by the 1980s, other countries had caught up and started surpassing us. So when politicians started wringing their hands about American students falling behind, the perception was not that everyone else caught back up, but that we'd actually gotten worse instead. And so, with a desire to look like we were doing something, we started flailing about politically. Soft subjects were deemed to not be in the national interest. Not based so much on well-researched studies and testing of hypotheses, but mostly on gut feelings and, to be honest, special interests with their own agendas. Let's break down what we lost by going this route. In art and music, studies show that arts education improves cognitive development, empathy, and problem solving. Schools that kept art programs had better academic outcomes, including in STEM classes. But we cut them anyway, because they weren't on the test. And creativity, declining. The Torrance tests of creative thinking, a standard measure of creativity, show that American students are less creative today than they were in the 1960s. We're raising kids who can fill in boxes but can't think outside of them. Looking at PE and recess, physical activity is linked to better focus, better academic performance, and better mental health. People, especially young people, aren't designed to sit still all day. But we cut PE and eliminated recess in many schools because we needed more time for test prep, and the insurance premiums were costly for no perceived academic benefit. This correlates to skyrocketing obesity rates and kids who are less healthy and more anxious than their 60s counterparts. Even academically, civic literacy in the United States is at an all-time low. Many students and some politicians can't name the 3 branches of government. They don't understand how laws are made. They don't know how to evaluate sources or think critically about the world around them, or understand how democracy works. Science used to be about doing, experiments, curiosity, discovery. Now it's about memorizing facts for a test. It's about placating political factions. It's about taking the fun out of learning something about something as wondrous as the physical world. It's not bad that you learn the periodic table for a test. It's bad if that's what you're taught science is. And it wasn't just the subjects that changed over the years, it was the how. Every few decades, someone decides the way we've been doing math for centuries needs a makeover. For example, in the 1960s, we were introduced to the new math. The idea was to teach kids a deeper understanding of numbers, not just how to do arithmetic, but why it works. It was sort of a backdoor pre-algebra, except instead of using letters, we had underscores, squares, and circles to fill in. It was a disaster. Parents couldn't help their kids with their homework. Teachers didn't understand it. Kids were confused. And it didn't help at all with algebra. So we went back to the old way: rote learning, memorization, arithmetic. And then in the 2000s, we did it again, but worse. We leveled up with Common Core math. Same idea: deep understanding, conceptual learning. And once again, parents couldn't help their kids. Teachers were confused. Kids were frustrated. Even worse, it's a lousy way to do math. Here's the thing: most kids don't need a deep understanding of how numbers work. Neither do most adults. They need to know how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, and how fractions work. They need arithmetic. And for most people, rote learning in elementary school works just fine, and once learned will last a lifetime. But we keep trying to reinvent the wheel, and every time it fails. Take reading as a case in point. In the 1980s and 90s, many schools stopped teaching reading with phonics, the method where you sound out words letter by letter. Instead, they switched to whole language learning, where kids are supposed to recognize words by sight and context. The result: kids today read worse than ever. Phonics work, it's been proven, but we've abandoned it anyway. And we've been paying the price. Even beyond coursework, the business of education also took its toll. Starting in the late 1970s, something else changed. Grades started to matter more than results. Administrators started pushing for preferred percentages of grades. They wanted a certain number of A's, a certain number of B's, and so forth. This forced grading to become more on the curve instead of objective. And failure? Failure was no longer an option in most cases. Kids started failing up, advancing through grades despite no scholastic competence. The message became everybody passes, everyone gets a diploma trophy. And the result? Students who graduate high school without basic skills. Students who can't read, can't write, can't do math, but have a diploma anyway. At the next level from that is the rise of charter schools, publicly funded private schools, and rampant homeschooling. The idea was to give parents choice, to create competition, to improve education. But here's what actually happened. Charter schools siphoned funding away from public schools. The schools that needed the most help again got less money. Private schools, schools with public vouchers, cherry-picked the best students and left the rest behind. And homeschooling? For some families, it works. But for many others, it's a way to avoid accountability, to teach opinion instead of fact, to isolate kids from the world and uncomfortable ideas. The overall result here? A more fragmented, more unequal education system. Which brings us to the great shortcut, the internet and AI. When I was in school, if you wanted to write a paper, oh, who am I kidding? When you were assigned a paper to write, you had to hike to the library. You had to wrestle with a card catalog and actually read a book. Writing notes by hand helped it stick in the brain. Now, between the crushing homework load and the high-stakes testing, can you blame a kid for wanting to Google it or running it through an AI? They aren't getting their hands dirty with the material because they're just trying to survive the pile-on. They aren't even copying or recopying homework they got from somebody else, which means that it isn't even visiting the brain for a minute or two. It's just copy and paste. But then you skip the struggle, the discovery, and the musing, the learning. And when you skip that process, you cheat society as much as you cheat yourself. So after all this, after decades of reform, did it work? Did STEM-focused education make American students more competitive? Let's look at the data. Test scores. The U.S. still lags behind Finland, Japan, South Korea, and other developed nations in math and science. Creativity, declining. Mental health, crisis levels. Anxiety, depression, burnout. Civic literacy, that's abysmal. And here's the kicker. Many STEM graduates can't find jobs in their chosen field. There's oversaturation in some areas, skills mismatch in others. So, no, STEM didn't fail entirely, but it didn't deliver on its promises either. Maybe the problem isn't that we need more STEM. Maybe it's that we need more everything else, like the poor boomers and Gen Xers had to suffer through while we walked to school in the snow, uphill, both ways. I'm not the first person to say this. In 2006, Sir Ken Robinson gave a TED Talk called "Do Schools Kill Creativity?" It's one of the most watched TED Talks of all time, and for a good reason. Robinson argued that our education system was designed for the industrial age. It was designed to create compliant workers, people who could follow instruction, sit still, and do repetitive tasks. But we're not in the industrial age anymore. We're in the information age, the creative age, and our education system hasn't caught up. Robinson said, we're educating people out of their creativity. And he was right. We're teaching kids that there's one right answer, that creativity doesn't matter, that art, music, and play are extras. And in doing so, we're killing the very thing that makes us human, our ability to think, create, improvise, imagine. I'll put a link to Robinson's TED Talk in the description. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's brilliant and funny. So where does that leave us? American schools didn't necessarily get worse, at least not at first, but we stopped evolving while the rest of the world improved. We sacrificed breadth for depth and ended up with neither. We built better test takers, not better thinkers. But it doesn't have to be this way. Countries like Finland have shown that you can have a broad curriculum, less testing, more play, and better outcomes. Studies show that arts integration improves STEM learning. We know that works. We just have to be willing to do it, to pay for it. So maybe it's time to ask, what kind of students and citizens do we actually want to create? Or if you're now a student, what do you want to become? I've long argued that kids are eager, desperate to learn if we let them and push them to their capabilities. So let me ask, are you? Are you desperate to get the quality of education you deserve? For you older folk, do you remember art class, music class, PE every day? How do you think your education would have been different or worse without them? Leave a comment or two. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And this is a very long video, so I'm just going to wrap it up and say I'm CJ, this is Geezer Gab, and remember, liking is groovy, subscribing is far out, and critical thinking, that's sexy as hell. See you next time.